Bear with us.
Well, they have so many penalizers and strikes. Because it used to be the law time, didn't it? That was in our time. I didn't realise that. I didn't realise how the law was adopted. Yes, he got It's fun, it's always fun. I don't know how you do it. I'm a great hider because I don't push it because when I'm actually doing it, I think, what you doing? It's always lovely. It's always lovely. You can't stop it. Too much of respect. Oh, they do that. They don't listen. After shooting someone with what do you do? Victories. That's about right. No, I just say oh, right. Oh, let's go. Yeah, you vote for Norman. Well, I don't mean he didn't get involved with it. He's got office for UCL, Edinburgh, Bristol. He wants to go to UCL. So he's loads of A-level information. You should see this.
Welcome everyone. Maybe a little bit louder. No, it's fine. Right? You hear me well, right? Yeah. Okay, welcome everyone to the Pushkin House. My name is Denis Maksimov. I'm a curator of exhibitions and public programming here, and we're very happy that you came today, this sort of very springy day, to listen about the monuments. And I'm happy to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Dzmitry Suslau, who is a lecturer in contemporary arts in UCL School of Slavonic and Eastern European Studies. He is also a co-founder of the initiative Climate Art, together with Evgenia Rovtsova, that commissions public installations relating to the climate change. And he also was previously working in VNA and as well involved in several other organizations that deal with preservation of cultural heritage. So he is the perfect person to address today's subject, which we titled Monuments and Their Fate. And today, I hope also Dzmitry will address in part of his talk some maybe revelations about the upcoming book that he's working on that deals with the public monuments in Vilnius, Minsk, and Kaliningrad. And in general, this event is conceived and envisioned in the context of our discursive program of this year. One of the primary subjects of this year called What's in an A? And we asked a lot of questions in this context about the monumentality, about the future of monuments, about what to do with the public monuments that exist already now, what to do with the monuments that are planned to be built, and there are quite a lot of them still being opened, whether the concept of monumentality that we address at the moment and still continue to materialize in the form of those public objects that we see all around the squares is totally outdated. So all of those exciting questions we also will be happy to discuss with you after the Dzmitry's talk and the Q&A. And without further ado, I am very excited to give the floor to Dzmitry.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Denis, can you all hear me fine? Yeah, okay, great. Well, thanks so much for coming here. And my name is Dzmitry, as already been announced. Apparently, the clicker doesn't work, so I'll be making some strange body movements to suggest, next slide. But it's really great to be here and talk about the monuments, and maybe I'll just briefly actually introduce a book project at the start of the talk tonight. Indeed, I'm looking at the sort of counter monumentality, and monumentality is some of the terms I'll talk about later today in the upcoming book, which in fact is something I'm reworking from my PhD, which focuses on that very much, that issue of public memory in transnational context. Today I think what we can do, and I'm prepared to talk about, is just a brief overview of the history of the monument. And I think, when we think about public monuments, oftentimes, one could envisage a very kind of almost, as James E. Young, a very famous and renowned scholar of Judaic and English studies, once wrote, monuments could be seen as a sort of almost natural outcrops, almost geological outcrops on the national landscape. But in fact, what I'd like to talk about today is how a monument is a very situated concept, a very historically situated concept, and it's very much linked to the idea of a 19th century vintage of the nation state. And also to open this discussion tonight, I kind of want to show a very quick video from a couple of weeks back. I don't know if many of you heard about the proposed National Holocaust Memorial in London that is meant to open next to the Parliament, and there was an open discussion about whether or not this is the right location for the monument and a learning centre. So if we can maybe show the video.
This is a completely idiotic idea. And a learning is almost an insult to think of a learning centre. What are we learning now that we haven't learned in 80 years? What are we learning? We shouldn't kill each other? Good idea. So what are we learning? Yeah. What else do you want to know?
I think just being succinct, but
I'm opposed that we need to talk about this place, which is contrary to everything sensible and will not serve any purpose.
that's
I suppose we can maybe stop here. So the key message was delivered, awkward silence and mumbling after that parliamentary discussion. Anita Lasker-Wolfish is a 98-year-old Auschwitz survivor who spoke in this very lucid and a very moving way about the necessity of monuments and particularly learning and this sort of supposed didacticism of a monument, a memorial. And I think this is sort of key to my discussion tonight because monuments, in particular, the ones we're talking about, well, I'll be talking about here tonight, are seen as a particular embodiment of a narrative, of a national narrative that was selected to be remembered and sort of not forgotten, and was selected out of many plural narratives that are available out there, and was seen as almost stifling and paralysing idea of remembering a particular notion of history. And so I think one of the first, as I said, very much the 19th century idea here, we have the three great examples of a so-called statuomania. This is a wonderful quote from the Contemporary Review in 1882. The rage for statues now being erected all over France seems to be degenerating into statuomania. So this idea of statues as a particular personification of a nation, as I said, is very much linked to the idea of a nation. And the three examples here, one of them is obviously probably quite well recognized, is from Paris, from Place de la République. Obviously, they're all examples of Marianne, the personification of France. The other two are probably more intimate and lesser known. And French historian Maurice Augulon, who wrote a lot about French statuomania, following the Franco-Prussian Wars of 1870-1871, suggested that it was actually interesting to look at the different communes and how radical they were. Because if we look at the way Marianne was depicted, most radical commune would allow her to bear at least one of her breasts. So as you can see on one of the images here, probably came from a very radical commune indeed. And the next type of monument that we associate with this particular form is a war memorial. And obviously there were war memorials before this date, but obviously the Great War and the gruesome death toll experienced across the world at that time helped make a form of commemoration particularly uniform and sort of developed certain blueprints for commemoration. And so the two examples I've chosen here, unfortunately the cenotaph is covered by the text here, but you can all sort of recognize it, I'm sure. And obviously the tomb of the unknown soldier, another such memorial. Already at that time, when those memorials were appearing in the early 20th century, people were suggesting, some critics were suggesting that those memorials, in fact, allowed to justify the war and sort of gloss over the impossibility of personal loss and impossibility of the wars as a narrative, and making it as a sort of almost acceptable narrative that could be perceived and perpetuated. Another very well-known, and I suppose a lot of you are familiar with Anderson's Imagined Communities. But one of the things he was suggesting about talking about those two types of monuments as the more arresting emblems of nationalism. So, for instance, on the tomb of that known soldier, no one ever writes the nation of the soldier. It's always understandable from the context that that soldier would be either German or French or indeed American, and it just suggests this particular link between that type of commemoration of the war and a nation state. He suggested a rather silly idea of maybe talking about the tomb of an unknown Marxist, for instance, obviously, which does sound quite an absurd idea and proposition, and again suggests this particular type of commemoration. There's a lot of text written about it, and German historian George Moser wrote a lot about war memorials, and analysing this visual language, particularly in Europe and America, which is very much linked to Christianity and linking fallen soldiers to Christ himself, oftentimes. Next slide. And so this very idea of a monument, a memorial, is outdated and outmoded, as I suggested earlier, was appearing quite forcibly and sort of vocally around America and Europe in the 20th century. One of the quotes I suggested for the description of that is from the Austrian modernist writer Musil, who wrote that memorials and monuments are the most invisible things in the world. And he then follows to say, we throw the famous deceased into the sea of forgetfulness with a stone memorial around their neck, pretty much suggesting that this particular type of commemoration doesn't quite work, it doesn't quite cut it. And another comment from around that time, Louis Mumford, a great American urban planner and architectural historian, said that monuments were absolutely dead. He, in fact, pronounced the deaths of monuments as early as the 1920s, suggesting that they are contradiction in terms. Contemporary monument would be seen as absolutely, inexplicably, and pointlessly contradictory. But despite that biting critique of monuments, they were being built throughout the 20th century in the interwar period. And the two examples here I have are from Moscow, from the plan and program launched by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, the program of monumental propaganda. Now, I don't know, quite a few people here, I'm sure, heard about the monumental propaganda program. It was launched in 1918 and as a sort of egalitarian form of commemorating and showcasing in public spaces the particular messaging to do with Marxism, some high ideas, and more trite and banal ideas, like, you know, a plaque here suggests some more kitchen sink wisdom of he who doesn't eat, or no, rather, well, we can read that. He who doesn't work, neither shall he eat. The other way around, I suppose. Interesting enough, Lenin was never quite actually interested in preserving those monuments. They were built from very cheap and readily accessible materials like plaster, so they were not actually meant to last. And you can see the next slide. Tasked with this rather banal and strange campaign were also the luminaries of the avant-garde art in the Soviet Union, who obviously, including Vladimir Tatlin, were quite scathing about the whole concept. Vladimir Tatlin, as a monument to the Third International, I'm sure an image that everyone here is familiar with, was in fact launched as a critique of a monument as an idea. It's deliberately unconstructible. It's impossible. It's a theoretical thing. Yeah. And again, obviously, I'm giving examples of totalitarian regimes here, but if we think about other nations around that same time, they were very happily launching and constructing monuments at that time. So including, for instance, newly liberated Baltic states like Lithuania in 1928 opened its first Liberty Memorial. So monuments were being constructed despite the criticisms at that time. But obviously, if we look at the Nazi Germany, we see a particular obsession with monumentality at that time. And in fact, statuary took precedence over all artistic forms of production around that time, and Arno Breker, whose sculpture from the Nazi parade grounds in Nuremberg in Zeppelin Field is displayed here. Arno Breker was one of Hitler's personal favourite artists, and this sort of obsession with an Aryan, lithe, muscular body was very much central to that type of art that the Nazi Germany wanted to produce and see on the streets of German cities. And obviously, the counterpoint here is infamous degenerate art exhibition. I'm sure quite a few people here heard about it. Obviously, what was seen by the fascist Germany as something that shouldn't be considered as art, i.e. any modernist type of art was seen as degenerate and not worthy of remembering and looking at, in fact. Although the exhibition did invite people to look at, and the catalogues that are still surviving are absolutely brilliant. So this connection between authoritarianism and monumentality was quite obvious and perhaps a little uncritical, but it was certainly something that towards the latter half of the 20th century was seen as quite inseparable, in fact. And you know, one of the critics, I chose a quote from Susan Sontag here, suggesting how, in fact, monumentality is a marker of totalitarianism and totalitarian regimes and modes of thinking, because this is the obsession with the grandiose, with perpetuation of one particular narrative is very much a totalitarian idea, as was seen by Sontag. And here we move to an interesting point, in my view, of the development of monuments and memorials. So the latter half of the 1960s, 1970s onwards, and particularly towards the 1980s, Germany started grappling with its unprecedented past, with its impossible past, and the Holocaust at that time, as a concept, was becoming more and more familiar amongst broader audiences. In fact, Theodor Adorno oft cited dictum that there can be no poetry after Auschwitz. Was now not seen as a thing. You know, in fact, a lot of popular culture artifacts from the time suggest that people were becoming more interested in that topic. In fact, I don't know if anyone's seen a miniseries from 1978 called Holocaust. Very sellable name, was leading Hollywood actors in the cast. And that miniseries, according to many scholars of the Holocaust and commemoration, actually propelled this public understanding of the Holocaust as amongst Americans, ordinary Americans, but also in Germany. It was broadcast in Western Germany to huge audiences on television. So, and it's all happening around that time. And around that time, the discussion of monuments as profoundly dictatorial is also happening amidst German artists. So if we can go to the next slide. So what is happening at that time in Germany? James E. Young, whom I've mentioned already, was in fact a scholar who influenced the development of this particular discussion in a very profound way. He worked directly with many of the artists at that time. And so what was seen and suggested by Young and the artists, such as Horst Hochheisel, Johann Gertz and many other artists working in Germany around that time, was the fact that we cannot simply commemorate something as profound as the Holocaust and as the loss of so many innocent lives with another vertical power radiating form, such as a monument. So something else was needed. And then James Young comes up with this concept of counter-monument, monument against itself, as he suggests. So monument was not meant to somehow, as I mentioned earlier, perpetuate a particular type of memory or a particular type of narrative, but in fact allow the audiences to remember. So to move away from one vertical power radiating symbol to something much more dialogical and democratic. And in fact, a lot of the artists who worked with James E. Young and also in Germany around that time came from performance art. So a lot of the techniques they were using are informed by performativity. So the idea was that the public are invited to remember. They shouldn't be just spectators, beholders of this particular version of the past. They should be taking active role in remembering and re-remembering, as James Young was arguing. So I'll show you a quick video from one of the examples, thank you so much, one of the examples of this monument, probably a paradigmatic example of a counter monument. Maybe we can have it full screen if that's possible. Oh no, okay, that's it. Okay, well, sorry, unfortunately the video is not great, but if some of you have not heard of it, I'll just briefly describe what happened. So in 1986, Hamburg announced a competition for a Holocaust memorial in the city, and the artist Johann Gertz and his partner at the time, Esther Gertz, won the competition, and they proposed a very different and radically novel idea of a monument. So they designed this 12-meter stele, which was meant to be a topographical harakiri, like a knife or sword, they described it in their artist statement, piercing through the body of German memory and forgetfulness. So the shaft of the monument was covered in lead and very pliable material, and styli were provided. So anyone who, any member of the public who wanted to subscribe to remembering the Holocaust, but also suggesting that no more future wars should happen and no more atrocities should be perpetrated in the name of any one nation state, was invited to sign the monument, and then the monument would be lowered until it disappeared entirely. So by 1993, I think, if I'm not mistaken, the monument disappeared from the face of the earth. If you are in Hamburg and visiting Hamburg, not a very remarkable outskirts of the town, you will still be able to see it there with the information attached. And maybe we'll talk about the critiques of this particular type of commemoration in a minute. So maybe we'll go back to the presentation. I'll showcase another paradigmatic example of a counter monument. Can you move 2 slides? Kassel, a German city which is known to many as a location for the renowned Documenta exhibition, is also a place where in the same year, 1986, was an open competition for a Holocaust memorial. And this was to replace a fountain known as Aschrott-Brunnen, so fountain sponsored by a Jewish former resident of the city, and destroyed during the Kristallnacht, and actually largely forgotten by most people and most residents of Kassel. So when the competition was launched in 1986, Horst Heisel, who won the competition, said, well, it's impossible to restore the monuments. It's absolutely impossible to restore it, and it's pointless. In fact, like it is pointless and impossible to restore the memory of all the people who died, and also somehow perpetuate it in a very convincing manner. So what he proposes instead was a negative form memorial, another counter memorial response to this topic. So he recreated the fountain in its original form, but then it was dug underneath and it's buried underneath. So you can't actually, all you see when you're in Kassel is just the foot of the fountain. The water, as you can see there, maybe on the right-hand side of it, there's a model there suggesting how the monument looks. So quite a deep sort of hole was dug for it to be installed there. And if we go back to the previous slide, you can see what it looks like to this day. So it's a base of a fountain with the water streaming down, suggesting the profundity of the loss, but also impossibility to somehow verbalize it or visualize it by concrete monumental thing. So that's another example of that particular engagement with a difficult, unpalatable past. The other two, I think, I'm not probably going to dwell on this too, so maybe we can just skip past 2 slides. So, just very briefly, so that notion of counter-monumentality was obviously extremely innovative theoretically. However, it wasn't without its precedent, both from the point of art history, but also from the point of view of popular culture and imagination. So if we think about, if anyone has seen Maya Lin's Vietnam Memorial in Washington, that was one of the first sort of forms that sort of inspired many German artists to come up with this radical minimalist ideas. But also there were earlier 1962 memorial in Paris to the deportees, to Vichy. So there were sort of similar things appearing throughout the 20th century. And James E. Young is somebody who remained extremely influential, and I tell a lot of my students that's that's really a way of making impact outside of academia. He's not only written a paper that was, cited by somebody else. In fact, he was on so many selection panels for many of the high-profile memorials, including obviously the 9/11 memorial competition in New York, which, if we look at it closely, I think visually, although James E. Young in subsequent interviews denies it, but I think visually there are similarities with the Kassel memorial we saw earlier. So this idea of, the idea that a lot of critics came up with is that in fact counter-monument didn't succeed as a notion because it didn't really produce another form of remembering or re-remembering. In fact, it just provided another visual option for commemorating a particular type of history or past, but in fact it didn't really allow people to remember in a different way, in a way that was different from traditional vertical war memorials of yesteryear. Maybe we can move on to how are we doing for time? Plenty of time. Okay, so maybe I'll just show you a couple more examples from around the world. So, for instance, again, we can see a memorial in Belarus. That's in fact part of a former concentration camp outside of Minsk in Blagoshchina, and as you can see, that sort of very similar visual language is minimalist and linear and horizontal and not vertical, very much replicated there. And if we move to the next slide, here's a couple of photographs from that particular site. Again, sorry, it's not a very, I hope it wasn't false advertising, it's not a very light and easy conversation we're having tonight. But the forest of Belarus, like many other forests around Eastern Europe during Nazi occupation, were obviously sites of mass atrocities even way before actually the Nazi occupation. This was a site of NKVD camps in Belarus as well. So what happened here, if you ever have a chance to go, obviously it's impossible now. However, the memorial was described by Magdalena Waligórska, a wonderful scholar of memory from Poland, as schizophrenic, because it has two parts to it. And unfortunately, I don't have an image for the official part, the sort of post-Soviet part, if you like, which very much utilizes those Christian tropes. There's a crown of thorns, the gaunt features on a statue which could be reminding of the figure of Christ, of course, etc. And then there's a non-official part, or a part that's a collaborative part. So what the strongman and dictator of Belarus, Lukashenko, proposed at that time, it was around 2018-19 when he was offering that, was in fact for any nation that had their former citizens perish in this particular camp to erect their own memorial there. In fact, it was a highly cynical thing to do, because it was seen by many as a way to get, as a bargaining chip with his negotiations with the EU and sort of allowing him some political presence at that time. And here we have a photograph of the then Austrian Chancellor and Lukashenko launching the Austrian memorial. But another horrible thing that happened inadvertently was that due to the nature of Jewish deportations from Germany and other parts of Western Europe, was the fact that it was extremely well documented. So in fact it was very easy to trace back all the names of people who did perish from Western Europe, which obviously is wonderful for the family members, but also for accountability and historical memory. However, all the Belarusian Eastern European Jews weren't really named, or there are very few details remaining about who in fact died, which creates this very strange hierarchy of victimhood. You know, sort of different victims are perpetuated while others are left to oblivion. And so that's another thing that sort of happened there. If we can maybe move on to the next slide. Yeah, so basically here I just wanted to propose a brief introduction to a counter or failed attempt at producing a counter narrative to monumentality, something that would allow to remember in an active way, something that might arguably have failed. And depending on time, I thought, I'll also talk about a more sort of expected thing of me, I suppose, in Pushkin House, although I know we're branching out. I'll talk about more post-Soviet things and removals of Lenins, which I'm sure a lot of people have spoken about here before me. So this particular video is from, it's still from a video, in fact it's an artwork by Denis Maksimov, a contemporary Lithuanian artist, but in fact he reworked a contemporary footage from the 1990s of the removal of the Lenin statue from the main square in Vilnius. And here he sort of video edited in a way that the gathering crowds are applauding not to the removal of Lenin, but actually his reappearance on the pedestal. So he just rewinded the video, and you can see it. I think it's still on show at MoMA, or maybe it's just in that collection. But this particular one, I just want to, if we can move to the next slide. Yeah, unfortunately my animation, which was far too clever, didn't quite work, but it sort of showcased the square, the changing square in Vilnius. So very briefly, you saw the Lenin statue being removed. You can visualize it, sort of almost, you can see there on the left-hand side, there's some sort of rose-tinted paths lit into the Lenin statue, which was there in the 1980s still. So when it was removed, there was a very obvious void left by the departure of the leader of the world proletariat, and the newly independent Lithuania wanted to find a new symbol to take its place. And the debate is still ongoing. In fact, it's one of my favorite examples, in fact, of that kind of monumental discussion, when actually monument could be seen not as a concrete thing, not as a thing on a pedestal, but actually all the discourse surrounding it and all the debates and all the public anger at an attempt of constructing a particular petrified version of the past that would go up on the square and sort of let the beholder sort of ponder this historical importance. The winning design for the square was in fact a counter-monumental in its scope. It was a very vertical symbol, sort of a hill of freedom, which won the competitions, but despite being the winning project, hasn't been realised due to many political controversies around it. A lot of the more far-leaning, nationalist-leaning parts of Lithuanian society want to see an equestrian statue there. So there we are. Maybe another slide. Yes, and also, a couple of examples from from today, and also maybe it's something we can talk about. So I've not noticed anyone falling asleep, so that's really good for me. So, but obviously, all the debates I tried to allude to about the incompatibility of monuments with contemporary common sense, with contemporary sensibilities, were happening in the 1920s already. Yet we're still having these debates today, we're still having those discussions today, and people are still trying to erect, as it were, a particular vision of the past in a particular monumental form. So this example is obviously very controversial. It's from the occupied Crimea, and one of the first monuments installed there, I think in 2016. That's the monument to the so-called, or memorial to the so-called polite people. So again, that perpetuates this Russian notion of how Crimea was taken over. In fact, I don't think annexation is a term used in Moscow. I think we use a different one. I don't quite know what it is, but maybe a reunification, Anschluss. I don't quite know. This is a memorial, depicting in a very grotesquely simplified way a kindly soldier patting a cat and giving a chocolate or flowers or something to a little girl. Anyway, you'll see loads of such memorials and monuments across Russia. What I think is interesting for me in this particular image is this linkage between this Russian type of war commemoration and the visual language that is used, but also the role of the Orthodox Church that is very much prominent there. And you can see the priests in their saintly garments, whatever they're doing, sprinkling it with holy water, I'm sure. So it's interesting. Natalia Danilova, a scholar, I think still based in the UK, wrote a fantastic book on the war memorials in Britain and Russia, a very interesting comparative study. And what she argues in that book is that during the reign of Vladimir Putin, the complete sort of merger of the Great War myths, obviously the Second World War known in the former Soviet Union, state of Russia and other, like Belarus, still as Great Patriotic War, and was always, throughout the Soviet history, seen as an achievement of all Soviet peoples. However, what happened gradually in Russia throughout the first half of the 21st century was this merger of this idea with national idea, and in fact, the way that the history and that victory in particular is depicted is as a national victory of Russians, and as an Orthodox victory, as a white victory, as a victory of a particular type of persons, disregarding all other, obviously, Soviet soldiers who fought in the war. So she's talking about that, and I think this memorial is, in particular, a good example. It's not obviously the Second World War memorial, but it's sort of the same version of that variation of the theme, really. And if we move on to the next slide, which, unfortunately, again, this is from London, so just to showcase that you can find problematic war commemoration wherever you are, really, and I think war commemoration as such is problematic. This is a the Gurkha Memorial in London. You can still see it. The Gurkhas obviously are still part of the British Army and have been for the past 200 years. They've fought in many conflicts, including the 2 World Wars and others. And this memorial there, unfortunately, the Journal Lumley image there covers the inscription on the pedestal, but I'll try to recreate it as best as I could. It's the bravest, I have it somewhere in my notes, but so the bravest people who fought for us, the best friends of the British people. You know, that memorial was raised in 1997. However, what was happening at the same time was the fact that later on became widely known that Goebbels actually never had, up until that point, same conditions of service in the British Army. They weren't actually recognised. And a lot of the people who served for the British Army from the Goebbels weren't allowed to settle in the UK afterwards as retirees. And obviously, Journal Lumley was a key name in this campaign for justice, and in fact, justice did triumph. However, the memorial was raised 10 or more years earlier. So there we are. I don't know if there are any more slides. No. Well, perfect. Well, maybe how are we doing for time? We're still.
You can have some a little bit like 5-10 minutes.
Okay. Yes. Perfect. So just to conclude, what I've been trying quite incoherently, I'm sure, to talk about for the past 10 minutes, which seems like a time until this chat. Anyway, so I think the conclusion, I'd rather would like to have a debate, but the conclusion I could draw for myself is that thinking of monument as a concrete thing is particularly is unhelpful, and in fact it doesn't quite land when we think about what is permanent and what is not, what is forgotten, what remains in public psyche and public and national memory. And I think probably, actually, ironically, the most permanent thing about monuments and memorials is the impermanence of their meaning. So they disappear from public consciousness for a time, and then when some colonial atrocity or something like that comes to the fore, people attack, dismantle, and remove the monument. And all those iconoclastic gestures are obviously very part and parcel of commemoration and monumentality. And I'm happily going to talk to you about that as well, if that's one of the questions. But I think probably a more helpful way of thinking about memory in public discourse and memory, historical memory, or cultural memory, is as a process and as a continued debate. And I think that's probably the only sensible way forwards for any particular type of commemoration. So what it leads us with is not an equestrian statue on a pedestal, but perhaps an empty plinth, as we have in Trafalgar Square, or in fact an empty square in Lithuania, which is trying to embody a particular version of a national past, yet doesn't quite achieve that coherent image. And conclude again, I've probably quoted James Young about 15 times today, originally. He wrote quite recently that in the increasingly democratic age, we cannot talk about one version of the past and one memory. So the cacophony of memories which all have to be accounted for in the public realm, I say. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Dzmitry, for this fascinating talk with a lot of examples and cases that both, I think, speak about the current condition of monumentality and about the possible ways of thinking about monumentality. I'll maybe start with my question, as I have a privilege of being a host as well. I wonder what you think about relation in the context of the concept of monumentality to the concept of the places of memory, lieux de mémoire. You spoke in your examples about particular types of monuments, some of them which commemorate specific events, which could be also place of memory, but some of them located in specific space that is meant to be reinterpreted with a new monument being erected in a place. So I wonder, how do you place this idea of the site of the cultural memory, and how the siteness of the cultural memory is being present in contemporaneity as well, when some of the events or the sites become global, or it's not that they were not global before, but the awareness in the public consciousness becomes global. And I think the Holocaust memorials are a very good example. And they're popping up basically in around still up to until now. And the video that you showed also, I think, was posing a very relevant, critical question to the interview of what we exactly commemorating there. So that side of memory, I think, in relation to some of these issues, is something that I'm quite, grappling with as a question mark.
Thank you so much, Denis. So, site of memory, if you're not familiar with the concept, was proposed by French historian Pierre Nora in the 1980s, and in his original Lieu de Mémoire was a suggestion that something, a cultural artifact, it could be a book, it could be a site, it could be a street, it could be a square, it could be a song, becomes a site of memory by dint of human will, I think he says, or by historical changes. So basically, and he then, in his voluminous study of France in the 1980s, he writes about those different types of lieu de mémoire, and the concept has been used subsequently in memory studies later. I personally, while lieu de mémoire is a great concept, and I think it's still a workable term, I personally think that a Polish scholar, Sławomir Kaprawski, proposed a notion of memoryscape. So his idea was that a memoryscape very much, and again he reinterpreted certain other scholars in his writing, but his idea was that lieu de mémoire in a way is more one-sided because it's one particular element that somehow is remembered by a wider community, whereas memoryscapes suggest this wider sea of remembering, and particularly the existence of conflicting views of the past that come and clash. I mean, there's an ideological clash, there's a cultural clash. So he's talking about those different sites. That could be, again, there could be physical sites in the city, like, for instance, the square Vilnius I showcased is a great example because there are two different versions of the past vying for remembrance, but also it could be a site that is not a physical one. So I think that concept of memoryscape as memory as a living and contradictory and conflicting being, I think is more exciting and probably helps us to talk about and conceptualize the Holocaust commemoration in the 21st century as well.
Thank you so much. So, some questions from the audience.
Thank you so much, Dzmitry. It's a very complex subject, and you managed to summarize it very nicely in this 45 minutes. As I said, it's a very complex subject. No, I mean, I've been very interested on this particular aspect. And you mentioned about the idea of time at the end of and which is something very, very key, particularly when we are talking about the politics of memory and what is the role that monuments play in that, and what we understand as a monument compared to public art or that is something that is connected to what the historian Joseph Rick was analyzing in the politics of memory, and when he was analyzing we have put a lot of emphasis on monuments that are dedicated or to the Holocaust. But where do we draw the line in history? Because if we start tracing back and we look at many monuments that are part of our urban landscape, many of them they are very conflicted. However, we don't question them. You know, we only question the ones that are more connected to recent events, and that is it could be traced back to maybe 100, 150, maybe 200 year max. That is something that is radically changing now. When there is we have the case of the Holocaust monument by the Houses of Parliament, which is having controversial from the very beginning. But there is now another range of monuments that are Thomas J. Price, the artist, that is now creating these big sculptures, 3 meters long, of average people. And trying to question how this politics of memory can be redefined. and how like obviously like monuments are decided by people that are in power, or people that can afford, which is the government, or like private enterprises that decide to put them there, and how we can question that. And that I'm very interested in like the new rates, and what are your thoughts on like words like Thomas J. Price, who is like portraying the average person. Often they are like teenagers from minority backgrounds, portraying them in daily outfits and like holding their iPhone.
That's a one dance question.
Yes, very long question. Thank you so much. I think I'll try to be brief and just respond to that. A German scholar, again, Alison Riegel, wrote about monument as a process rather than a thing. And again, I've been trying to allude to this today, and that's really informed my writing as well. I think if we think about monuments in that respect, that allows us to somehow marry the very conflicting views that we otherwise have. You know, whether something should remain on the square or not is probably not that's important, but I think what's more important is the processes around it, that there's actually a democratic public debate about what has to stay and what shouldn't stay, and also why do people really care about this or that particular form of commemoration. So I think really thinking discursively about monuments as a process rather than a physical embodiment of some sort, I think it's probably a more helpful way of analysing it. But of course, otherwise, you know, I think people who commission the monuments probably rarely have very nuanced or dialogical ideas, and it's very much this vertical idea of petrifying a particular version of the past from top to bottom, that kind of idea of monument as a permanent thing. But I think as some of the examples from the 20th century I was trying to showcase suggest, there's really nothing permanent. We really can't. Not all the monuments would last. And obviously in Britain, with the discussion after Black Lives Matter, with lots of monuments being destructed, and maybe rightfully so, and or at least debated. I think maybe removing a monument isn't a particularly helpful thing, but in fact it suggests that there's a particular interaction with history. And I think Germany is a great example because they had to deal with this very difficult past. And in fact, they had to incorporate that absolutely unglorifying chapters of their history as part of their national canon, as part of their self-identity. So that's why probably Germany is a great example, because there are a lot of things that happened there. Had they achieved it entirely is a question, I think, because again, a lot of the counter monuments I was showing are now seen as commonplace, as a blueprint for other commemorative sites, as just a visual iteration of a monument. So I don't know. So I think we can't really give a monument it's just, I think, an unrealizable task of embodying one complex thing through physical architectural form. So that's my thinking on the subject. Thank you.
And maybe to the last point of the question, what do you think about the commemorating and monumentalizing everyday average people, like a Thomas J. Price work, as you mentioned, which is, I thought would be nice to read.
Yes, thank you. I think it's wonderful. I'm not actually familiar with his work, so I would probably be just speculating here. But I'll look it up. Thank you so much for suggesting it. I think it's. I don't know. I mean, I would need to see the work. Is it critiquing a form of commemoration? Is it well? So there we are. So I'm not going to just say rubbish. But yeah.
Yes, please.
Thank you, it's been lovely. You've mentioned about a lot of monuments being destructed for many obvious and unobvious reasons, which in my understanding is messing up with history as such, in a way. What about the other side of it, which is happening in Russia now, when they are reinstalling the monuments of who, mostly Stalin, in quite a few cities, and they are going through with it. The democratic debate with the society about it obviously is out of the question. So just your opinion, where is that line of what? Is it new? Is it old? What do we do?
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's a great question. I don't know whether it's new or old, because if we look at Russian history, even throughout the 20th century, the monumental propaganda I was talking about earlier was also an iconoclastic project. So a lot of, apart from constructing those temporary monuments, all the older monuments of Tsars and their helpers, their servants, I think Lenin phrased it, were removed en masse. Some of them were returned. Of course, we have, you know, in the 90s, when this new vision of Russia as reuniting with its pre-revolutionary past, you know, saw a lot of the monuments to Catherine the Great being returned or restored. I did my fieldwork in Kaliningrad, which is another fascinating place, because of obviously formerly, if you're not familiar, it's formerly German, Königsberg. So what we saw there in the 90s was the return of some German 19th century monuments there. So I think things like that do happen. Obviously, I'm not comparing, but I'm just thinking what I've been saying. I'm not comparing Catherine the Great to Stalin, of course, but I think as a particular historical figure of relevance to this or that regime, I think that serves a purpose. So that's a symbolic sort of reminder of the past that's returned. I think it's just a question of what's being returned. I think what fascinates me as well with Russia is that it's not entirely just return of old monuments, but it's this transformation of older forms in a sort of seemingly invisible way, but in fact quite obvious to me. So, for instance, I'm from Belarus. I grew up in Belarus, which is was known and still is known as a partisan republic. So, a republic where the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War, was part and parcel of this identity. So, war memorials is something I saw on a daily basis. The main square in Minsk is called the Victories Square and has one of the first Second World War memorials in the Soviet Union there. However, it was profoundly anti-religious. There was no religious symbolism to it. Obviously, not overtly religious. So obviously, all of the tropes, if we look at the Soviet War memorials, are quite comparable to the earlier First World War memorials in Britain, for instance. There's all this kind of the death of a soldier so that the nation could survive in a very kind of saintly way, sort of justifying the death and killing. But then it wasn't overtly religious. Now, new war memorials in Russia combine the visual language of the Soviet Union, so hammer and sickle, some of the medals, victory ribbons, the bi-colour ribbons, with some religious symbolism as well. So it's kind of an interesting point. But returning of, I don't know, it was a very good question. I think it's impossible to answer it. I don't know what will happen to Stalin monuments now being returned to Russia. Will they be, again, destructed? Will they be moved to a site like a Memento Park in Budapest? I don't know if anyone in the audience has been to Budapest, the park of former discarded symbols there.
And there are priests, spraying the monument of Stalin with holy water.
Well, there we go.
And they open it, just to add to it.
Yeah, well, exactly. No, thank you. I mean, it's a great question.
Fascinating talk, Dima, absolutely. I'm just puzzled in a funny way why you didn't perhaps have a photograph of the Berlin Holocaust memorial.
Yeah.
Because I'm not an expert like you. I've seen maybe 5 or 6, but to me that was by far the most impressive because it's enormous. It's all these slanting, I suppose it's steel. And was there a reason you didn't allude to that?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, no, it wasn't a reason. I agree, it's a great memorial. In fact, James Young, I was referring to today, was on the selection panel for this particular memorial. So it's very much a continuation of this particular type of commemoration. I didn't mention it for the reasons of time, really, but I think what's interesting about that particular commemorative form, I'm sure a lot of you here are familiar with the memorial Harriet is referring to. But earlier in the 90s, when there was a discussion for a monument to the murdered Jews of all the murdered Jews in Berlin to go up. One of the artists I alluded to, in fact, Horst Heisel, whose monument you see here, proposed a very radical idea. What he suggested would be the best way to commemorate all the murdered Jews of Europe would be to destroy the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin and sprinkle the dust of the gate across the site, and that would be a way of commemorating the murdered Jews of Europe. Only destruction could commemorate destruction, he argued. Only absence could commemorate absence or represent absence. And of course, it was, again, radically unrealizable proposal. But I think, to me, it suggested this idea of discussion of what a monument could be. But obviously, the fantastic one they ended up designing, and in fact, I had the privilege of talking to James Young about it. It was meant to be even more, because it's physically really quite. I don't know, it depends on how you perceive it. Obviously, a lot of people. Some people who visited don't realise that it's a Holocaust memorial site. They just take a lot of selfies and jump around. The original height of those elements was meant to be much higher and much taller. So in fact, due to health and safety reasons, they decided not to go ahead, because it would have been quite murderous for people, if they were trying to jump, because it's probably quite tempting for a lot of urban dwellers to engage with this type of architectural form in that way. But there we are. But yes, thank you. It's a great example.
Thanks again for a wonderful talk. I asked this as someone who's completely not with a visual culture at all, but one thing that struck me when you were talking is this idea of how the meaning of a monument changes so much over time, presumably particularly as we go from living memory to sort of artificial memory, or sort of states of cultural memory, etc., etc. I wonder, is there a place for monuments to consider their own future? Are there examples of it, or is it just a sort of fool's endeavour for the monument to actually consider what its future will be in situ?
I think that not everyone had the question, but So the question, if I understood it correctly, was: is there space for monuments to consider their own future? It's a wonderfully philosophical question. I feel that absolutely is space for that. In fact, I don't know. In fact, I could think of a couple of examples, but then they all end up really not quite getting to the point. So obviously, the Four Splints in London, I think, is a fantastic example of a maybe not counter monument, but a post monument. An empty plinth and open to interpretation. Again, it's performative, and I think some of the commissions were better than others. You can argue about taste, you can argue about reasons behind it, but I think generally, as a conceptual tool of memory making or engaging with the history of a particular nation, it might be an interesting form of doing that. And again, obviously, if we think about the 21st century and the way we perceive information, a lot of it is not just the physical representation in situ, but it would be the archival images, the websites, the news reels, whatever, which all arguably create this meta-narrative of the monument. And so I suppose that's a way of thinking about the futurity of a monument in that way. But yeah, thank you for the question.
Maybe I'll double down on that question a little bit from my side as well. I wonder what you also think about the idea and the concepts of the monuments that are being introduced from the contemporary art practices. We've already discussed some.
Yeah.
But for example, ephemeral monumentality. For example, in the practice of Felipe González Torres, the monuments, let's say, temporary monuments to the AIDS pandemic victims that look like big piles of candies that are meant to be picked up by the public and disappear. So those, for example, ideas that appear from the contemporary practices, do you happen as well to engage with some of those, for example, ideas or practices that could emerge in other attitudes as well to monumentality or cultural memory?
Yeah. Well, thank you, James. Yes, absolutely, and I think it sort of links to some of the examples I've spoken about earlier. The idea that, yeah, I think it's a performative strategy which actively engages audiences to take part in a particular commemoration or remembering. So the term counter-monument as such might be unhelpful here because it looks very much at what the monument is against. However, we could think about this type of memorial or monument, and very much informed by contemporary art practices, would be a performative monument, a term proposed by Musil. Think of performativity as a tool of engaging with a particular type of reality, but also a particular way of engaging with audiences. So for instance, if we think about ephemeral art, like performance art, we are only familiar with a lot of the works by very famous performance artists through archives, through footage, through exhibitions, yet somehow we still perceive this type of work as performance, or the kind of the contextualization of the performance. So I think absolutely, yet this is certainly something that could be and is being used in commemoration and memorials as well. But obviously not a lot of the state-sponsored ones go down that route. Yeah.
Thank you, Dina. I don't know quite if this is a question or not. I don't know how to phrase it politely.
My favourite question.
But it's a bit about national identity. Yeah. And I don't want to call people appealing to the people as the lowest common denominator. But there is an element of appealing. There is an element of appealing to the people when you're creating an element that's meant to either symbolise national pride or national mourning. And I'm thinking very specifically of the Diana Memorial, which actually isn't about the memorial itself. It was about the process of involving people at grassroots level in the national grieving process. You know, what you think of the monument or not, what you think of the person that's being memorialised or not is largely irrelevant. But how do you get through the paradox of doing something meaningful for the nation and yet appealing to people who might not always appreciate the broader context? Because that for me was more a process than it was actually about the monument itself. So you're monumentalising a person, you're monumentalising a moment in time that becomes disappears, or you know, how would you do something like that in terms of making sure it stays true to its form and its purpose? Feel free not to answer.
No, I think it's a great question. In fact, there's so many layers to the question which I will try to untangle. Well, firstly, the idea of a nation state, as embodied by early examples I've shown today, is quite a 19th century construct. It's a very particular type of an imagined community, as was argued by various eminent historians. So obviously that type of commemorating that sort of past and that sort of notion of the past is of course inadequate in the current day and age, when we realise that there are multiple pasts, there are multiple memories, and at times they're in conflict with one another. So I think yes, absolutely, the process is really fascinating. I think where we just end up being is a lot of it remains invisible to somebody, to a beholder, to a passerby. You know, if you just walk past Diana Memorial or any other such thing that appeared through dialogue or through negotiation, you're not necessarily familiar with what is going on. But I didn't know whether that's important or not, because again, that taps into the question: who are the public, and what is public? And I can go on a bit about public versus private space, and also the idea of who is considered in a creation of particular work. So I think, in my view, a more, and you may disagree with it, but I am, as a curator working in public space and with public artworks, to me, publicness of an artwork is not inherent to its location. So obviously, it cannot just place a monument or anything else out of doors, out of this museological space, and make it public. Obviously, it's not what makes things public. Public is a more psychological concept, I think, a way of engaging with all those difficult and conflicting ideas and narratives. So I think, yeah, that's absolutely how art should be commissioned. There should be negotiation and discussion, and multiple voices should be heard. Whether or not that produces visually appealing or successful artworks, that's another question. But at least the process is fascinating. I find. Yes.
I love this Diana monument, but we're touching now on something that nobody's raised. You have a project, however contemporary, there are conditions attached. The point about this monument is water should flow the whole time, round. It's an elliptical circle. It was designed for children who, Diana loved children, to run in and out, be a free space. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful shape. Well, the water never flowed. I went very early on, and many, many times I go to that part of Hyde Park, and nobody explained to me why, but the conditions by which that monument should be beautiful are not being met.
Yeah, but do you know why? Do you know why there's
Yeah, please.
too many children slipped and hurt themselves? So yeah, that's why.
Another problem.
There we go, yes.
Design flaw.
Thank you. Didn't know.
Poetic. Any other questions, please? Yes.
Just a question. When I think of the United States, possibly the most remarkable and important monument in the country is really not a monument, but a speech, the Gettysburg Address, which was actually given in the site of a battle. I wonder if anything has been written about that in terms of it being a monument, and where are the, in academic writing, what are the confines of what is deemed a monument? How physical, how much does it require a site? I mean, this is kind of a theoretical question.
Thank you. It's a great question, and I think it could be answered by a term we sort of alluded to earlier today, the site of memory. So the site of memory, a concept proposed by Pierre Noir, is any reminder, any mnemonic tool that reminds a nation or any collective of its particular past or a particular national idea. So that's how he wrote about France. So for instance, he saw some of the songs, I can't remember which ones, probably the most obvious ones, as a site of memory, as well as Bastille, the actual very much building, brick and mortar, as a site of memory. So I think the site of memory encapsulates what you're alluding to. And in fact, that's another thing that what I can add to something I've not mentioned yet. Obviously, monuments are not seen as the most successful in delivering what they are there to deliver. However, sites of memory often are alluded to as something that allows a particular collective or certain groups, certain disparate groups to connect to a particular notion of the past. So yeah, so absolutely, that's a great example, I think, of a site of memory, or lieu de mémoire.
I was just wondering about a very interesting, sorry, I could project. Thank you. Hi, yeah, I was just wondering about the monument in context of the city and the classical city, which seems to be often where we derive the idea of monument placing in terms of sight line, of focal point, triumphal arch, all those sorts of elements of classical language, and how that got revived in a neoclassical age in a rather chilled way, and how then that leads us to consider the disappearance of monuments. Do places seem naked without them? Are they living rooms without a television? You know, the Lithuania space actually seems to be, you know, from the pictures that I've seen of it, perfectly adequate without a monument, but nonetheless, people will need to fill it. And coming back to the famous American phrase, I think it's Tom Wolfe, about, you know, the monument, the public statue being the turd in the plaza.
Yes.
That has to be applied. Is there anything to say about how the design of the city begets the monument, and how perhaps in an era of the soft monument, for example, I would say Piccadilly Circus, I prefer the advertising to Eros, absolutely.
Yeah.
How in our time we can perhaps lose the fixed vertical monument of which you speak.
Yeah. What a great question! Thank you so much. Well, in fact, urban historians present in this auditorium, so I'm sure we'll talk later. So I'll try and answer as best as I could this question. I think it's absolutely brilliant. I think there are a couple of points I'd like to address here. So maybe the city. I think we absolutely have to think of monuments in the context of the city as a particular receptacle, as it were, of a different memorial narratives. So for instance, obviously monuments were designed, if we're talking about the 19th century classical monuments I was alluding to earlier, were designed for particular sites, were designed for particular cities, and very much formed that urban identity of that particular locality. I don't know, I entirely agree with you. I think the something I can't actually quite answer myself and can't really understand. The urge of constructing a vertical monument is still there. Whether or not, as you said, some examples could be, some people could argue that this is unnecessary, some people could argue that it is very much a necessary thing, but the urge is still very much there, and it's something I am still, I think is an open question really. I think the role of the cities, and also the cities as a particular kind of text, as we read through monuments and other sites of memory through maybe bookshops, I don't know, particular memories associated with the park. It's a very interesting perspective of looking at the monument. I don't think I've answered your question, but that's how I think about it. Anyway.
More questions? Anyone? Okay, I'll ask another question then.
Okay.
Maybe the last one, if there is nothing else to ask. You also have a curatorial practice, and you mentioned I mentioned Climate Art Project when I was introducing you. I wonder in your curatorial practice as well, and because you work with the public art, would you say that the public art could be seen as a response to the eternity in the concept of the monument and production of the temporary monument, a temporary gathering place, a place that is has the expiration dates, let's say, and something that also is movable, and something that could be presented in a different context, but also something that exists in a very particular period of time. So it's performative in a way.
Thank you. Such a great question. I think the gentleman there alluded to a wonderful quote about the turd on the plaza. Public art is such a complex beast. Yes, again, gosh, there's so many things I'd like to say about this. So let me try to distill it to a couple of points. Firstly, I think when we think about public art and as a practice, it's again a very situated practice. It appeared, obviously we can think about different historical precedents, but it appeared in America, predominantly in the 1960s, as a move against commodification of art. So the idea that art could be bought and sold through commercial art galleries was not very satisfactory to a lot of pioneering artists in the 1960s. A lot of them were performance artists, a lot of them were engaged with a different idea. So this idea of creating something that is not, that is site-specific, that responds to a particular site in a specific way, was a way of moving against this capitalist idea of art as a commodity. Of course, it was not successful if we look retrospectively now, because public art became part of urban redevelopment, gentrification. So in many cities globally, not just in America, but also in Europe, in London, we do have percentage for art schemes. So a lot of developers have to provide a certain budget for a particular public artwork. And again, critics like Patricia Phillips, who's been mentioned here, said that led to the creation of the Turd on the Plaza, of a sort of artwork that no one particularly needs and is not particularly public. And so that, I think, challenges a very different idea. Maybe some of the artworks are responding to the national narrative I've been talking about here today. In fact, recently in Kassel, during Documenta, there was a counter-memorial attempt at looking at others in contemporary German society, so not the Holocaust memory, but all the immigration experiences, and all the newcomers through an artwork. So there could be different public art projects for different needs. But I think, the idea, the origin of public art as a thing was slightly different from a monument. So it was seen as democratic, as not top-down, as something that could challenge this status quo. And unfortunately, it did fail, however, in a sort of grand scheme of things, but there are still exciting artists who are challenging different parameters and asking different questions through their work. So I think public art certainly has a great space to occupy.
Dzmitry, it was brilliant. There are a lot of other questions and there are myriads actually of conversations to have still. We didn't talk about fallen monuments, we didn't talk about defaced monuments, we didn't talk about the ways how to deal with fallen monuments that stand up again. So, but I invite you all to join Dzmitry and me in a bar.